Hi everyone. In this particular video, I want to go over testing form inputs or input elements in using the React testing library. So over here, I've written a very simple React component or form, which has just two input fields and a button where the first input is just taking the customer's name. The second input is taking the email of the customer, and the button is just to submit the entire form, right? And for this form, I'm not using the React state to capture the whatever the user inputs, because I don't want it to be a controlled input. I just want to use the form data which is already provided to us using from JavaScript, right? Yeah. So I have this. So this is the form submission, the event, which is pretty simple. I'll have the link to the code in the description or a pin comment, so you guys can take a much closer look at it. But what's in simple terms, what it's doing is just grabbing the fields or whatever the user has inputted, right, and then sending that off to a server somewhere on the in the world, right? And based on if the inputs have some values or not, if the input does not have any values, then we throw an error, which is then captured and then shown to the user that they have to fill the form. But if all the fields have been entered successfully, then based on the response that we get from the server, we are going to show some kind of information on that. And so that's the basic React component stuff that we have over here. So in the test file, right, I'm using the MSW for this test since we are dealing with some API requests, and I want to mock the process of the API, not necessarily mocking the fetch function itself, but the entire making an API request to a server somewhere and doing all sorts of things. That's what I want to mock on. Okay, so over here, I've written some very few test cases, where the first one is to show the customer's name. So when the user types whatever name of the customer into the input, we want to show that, right? And to perform that, these kind of event testing, we are going to use the user event, the library from the React testing library, and it has a type function, right? So using the user event, then the type, you are going to grab the name. So in this case, you are going to grab the input over here. So this time, but we are going to use the label element, right? The get by label text. So which is going to look for a label with the name, a label with the name. Then it is going to then look for the corresponding input which is attached to that particular label using the HTML4 attribute. So in this case, we have the name over here, and then this input is linked to this particular HTML4 label using this name and ID over here, right? So once it grabs that, then we can enter this value inside the field, which is a Marvin 18 block, whichever name that is. And then once that is entered, we expect to see the name inside the document or shown to the user, right? So we're going to use the get by display value and going to look for the Marvin 80 block. And what get by display value is going to do is simply going to look for this name from any of the inputs that we have on the page, or any of the HTML elements that have the value attribute, right? And the input element is one of those HTML elements that have the value attribute. So it's going to look for that and going to check if it has the Marvin 80 block name entered into it. So once it grabs that, it's going to check if it actually exists. That's why it's using to be in the document. And once that's done, so if it finds it, then it's successful. If it doesn't find it, then it's going to true, right? Yeah. And this is one of the reasons why I didn't use the state, is because in this particular case here, I can just type and then do the assertion right next to it. But if I was using the states where I'll have to create state to have the name and create another state to have the email, then I'll have to perform some await. So I have to wait using the screen.find by display value. So this one is a promise, so it's going to wait for all the state changes to be committed before it's going to then perform any kind of assertion to it, right? You can definitely go by that method if you are using the states, right? But if you're not using the use state or anything like that, you can just use the get by display value and just check it, right? If the inputs are uncontrolled, which is this case. Right, so the second test is going to test the email. Now for VS Code's pop-up. So it's going to test the email, but this time we are doing something a little bit different. So instead of us using the get by label text, we are rather using the get by row and then looking for a text box, right? The text box is there. These inputs have the row of text box by default. And we are going to look for a name, in this case, which is the accessible name. We are going to look for email. In this case, we're going to look for an input that has an ID and name of email, right? If this ID isn't there, it won't work. It won't be able to find that text box if you are using the get by row. So if you're using the get by row, ensure that you have the ID of that input there. And then obviously we are going to pass in the email of the person. You are going to perform the assertion just as we have done in the previous test. But this time we are going to use the get by label text. So there's another way that you can go about performing some assertions. So you grab the elements. We are going to ensure that this particular element is the one that has the value of Marvin 34 Aiden, right? So we are going to grab the email. Since we already have a label, which the HTML4 attribute or the 4 attribute is email, which is then linked to this input. So it's going to grab this input element and it's going to perform this assertion to check if its value actually is the email that the user has entered in. Right. So these are some of the basic things that you can actually do in using the user event library. There's more that you can also do. We are going to look at some of these, right? So one of them is clicking, right? So you can click on any element on the page using the user event, the click function. But you're going to grab the elements from the page and then perform the click attribute or anything like that, right? So in this test that we have over here, we're going to ensure that the user actually has entered some values before it has to enter some values. If not, we are going to show some alerts to the user to enter the values, right? So in this case, I'm just going ahead to click on the button. So once the button is clicked, it will then call this function immediately. It's going to grab the form values, the name and the email. Then it's going to check if the email and name does exist. If it doesn't exist, we are going to throw an error and it's going to be caught. Then we're going to check, do some few validation error over here. Since this custom error that I'm throwing, I'm adding this validation error of true. So one that's there, it should show that please ensure that the customer details is filled correctly, right? So it's going to show that onto the page to get the user to enter the customer's values, right? Okay, so in that case over here, since this is we are using a dispatch over here because we are using the use reducer. More on that, if you guys want, you can leave a comment in the video. Leave a comment. So if you guys are interested in knowing more about the use reducer hook, I can make a video on that. All right. Anyway, let's skip ahead. So since we are performing some state updates, right, we need to wait for the state updates to be done on the page before we perform any kind of a session, right? And that's what we are doing over here. We are using a find by text, right? So we are going to look for this text anywhere on our page, right? But we need to wait for all state updates to be done before we actually perform the session. So that's where the find by comes in. The find by are promise-based functions, right? Or the find by or find all, both of them are promise-based. So it's going to wait for any kind of state updates to be done before it then performs the assertion that it's going to be looking for. All right. And we are using the find by text since we are just looking for a text. We are not looking for an element or anything like that. We're just looking for a text, right? Okay. So in the next test is a little bit complicated since we are using the MSW. So in this case, we are actually going to perform some assertions or tests on the API request when it's successful or when it's false. Right. So over here, what I'm doing is simply to mock this endpoint, right, and then return a success of true. That means the request actually was successful, right? You can take a look at the MSW library for more information. I'll link it in the video description so you guys can take a look at it more. All right. So we are setting it up, right? That's why I'm using the server.u. So we are setting that mock before the test continues, right? So you're going to render out or you're going to show the form, and then we are going to enter in the customer's name and email. Once we have the name and email, we are going to submit the form. So once we click on the button, then we expect that the customer added successfully without errors actually shows up in the page, meaning that the request was successful. So it's going to ensure that all these other processes goes through successfully, nothing happens, and then to show onto the page that the customer was added to the system, right? And we are using the response.ok over here to actually, do this kind of check, right? So this whole test is going to ensure that the entire process of the admin or whoever it is enters the customer's details or whatever the form details, and then it's submitted to the server. The server gets it, performs any kind of whatever it's going to do with that data, and then return to us a successful request. That's what this whole test case is going to do. A pretty simple test case, right? And with this, you can make the change as much as possible that you want or anything like that. You can change the implementation or whatever that you want to do, but it won't affect this test case unless we actually maybe add some more fields to it or anything like that. But that's by the way. So in the last test case, we are actually going to perform the other side of it where the request actually fails. So that's why in this case we have a status of 500. That means that the request failed, probably on the server the customer is already created, or the server resources not available, or something happened during the registration process, right? So we want to send a response of any value other than 200, which is or 201, which it means that this request was successful. Okay, so once we've set up the server to always respond with a status of 500 or a failing request, then we can then proceed to perform the exact same events that the user will perform, entering the customer details and submitting the form. Once the form is submitted, we expect that the sorry could not add new customer, something happened, please try again. We expect that this should show up onto the page telling the user that the request didn't go through, something happened, the request failed, right? So that the person can try again or then contact the administrators of that. So once we have all that, we've then gone through all the test cases that this simple form is supposed to do, showing the messages, ensuring that the form inputs have the correct values, we're able to submit the form, and then ensure that the API request and everything it actually does go through. And we can ensure that all our test cases passes successfully, right? And that's all I have for today. If there's any questions or any comments that you guys want to give, you can definitely let me know in the comments. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks very much.